So I think it's just important to note that we're not waiting by the phone.
It's embarrassing for the Carney Liberals again. Welcome back to Moose and Loose. My name's David. Today, America has come out with a list of grievances, problems, irritants regarding negotiations between our two countries. And, well, they want to make a deal. Carney doesn't. He needs it for an election. This is putting Canada in a bit of a quagmire. We've got some other stuff here. Let's jump into this. Starting this episode off, we got Shreya Teese sharing the latest BC Angus Reid poll. You notice here, 44% for the Conservatives +4 and 42% for the NDP. And this is with Conservatives that doesn't have a permanent leader. So next election, David Eby will be out. We'll finally get rid of the safe supply nonsense. So if you didn't catch it, the Artemis rocket going to the moon.
3, 2, 1, booster ignition, and lift off. The crew of Artemis 2 now bound for the moon.
And there they go. Canada's Jeremy Hansen and the 3 U.S. astronauts on board with him lifting off, making history, and headed for the moon.
About a little more than 24 hours after they launched, there's going to be something called the translunar injection burn. And that is when they change trajectory completely and start heading toward the moon. And once that happens, they're just relying on gravity to take care of everything. So they go out towards the moon, and it's like a slingshot pulling them around and sending them back. And on that far side, they'll have about 20 to 40 minutes where there is no communication at all with the people on Earth, and they will be having a view of the sun hitting the moon on its backside that no human has ever seen with their eyes before. So really special. Then it's another 4 days for the trip back, splash down in the ocean. Bob's your uncle, 10-day mission. It's really exciting.
These distances are incredible. 4 days, as you said, to reach the moon. It is an extraordinary adventure, unlocking the mysteries of the universe, but practically.
I mean, that's not really a mystery. We've already had people on the moon. I thought they were going to be landing on the moon. I guess they're just going to the moon, which is not as exciting. But, I mean, at least they're getting back at it now after 53 years. We've got some good news here. So Trump just gave a speech, and basically the Coles notes here, we've got President Trump threatens to strike Iran's power plants if there is no peace deal reached. President Trump also announced that the Iran war will last another 2 to 3 weeks. We've seen the Strait of Hormuz opening up. You could think with all this pressure, countries needing oil, Australia, Vietnam, whoever, other countries running out or very close to running out, that we would get a pipeline going to the West Coast. And what happened with Alberta and the Liberal government? Carney failed to get a deal. There's no deal. April 1st passed. Only 2 of the 4 conditions were met. This is so pathetic. All we have to do is open up the sector and start building. And all they care about is net zero.
Sandy, there's been so many mixed messages about the U.S. war in Iran. Perhaps tonight, the president will give Americans a clearer picture of what he thinks victory looks like. President Donald Trump says he intends to declare mission accomplished in Iran soon.
I would say that within 2 weeks, maybe 3, we're hitting them very hard.
They are. The Pentagon says it's hit more than 11,000 targets, blasting Iranian vessels, damaging Iran's ballistic missiles, and decapitating much of Iran's senior leadership. Trump posted this morning, Iran's new regime president, much less radicalized, has just asked the U.S. for a ceasefire. We will consider when Hormuz Strait is open, free, and clear. But Iran's president was already president before the war. Tehran flatly rejects Trump's ceasefire claim, and Trump said it didn't matter if the strait was open or not. That critical waterway for global oil and shipping blocked by Tehran has sent oil and gas prices spiraling.
If France or some other country wants to get oil or gas, they'll go up through the strait and Hormuz Strait. They'll go right up there and they'll be able to fend for themselves. We have nothing to do with it.
It's no secret Trump is upset with America's allies. France, Spain, and Italy, even the UK, initially denied airspace and military support to Trump.
This is not our war. We will not be drawn into the conflict.
Lashing out in a British newspaper, Trump said, I'm strongly considering pulling out of NATO, calling the alliance a paper tiger, stating it's beyond reconsideration.
We are going to have to re-examine whether or not this alliance that has served this country well for a while is still serving that purpose, or has it now become a one-way street?
If the president tries to pull out of NATO, he'd trigger a congressional and likely constitutional battle. The president telling Reuters he plans to criticize NATO tonight in his speech to the nation.
So this is some good news. Hopefully this will be all wrapped up in the next 2 or 3 weeks and gas prices come back down. Moving ahead, we're getting some updates on what's happening with the negotiations with America. And well, American News came out with this. We're seeing this on CTV. 10 concerns the U.S. listed about Canada in its report on foreign trade barriers. So we've got American stumbling juice, dairy, the supply management. We've got composition of cheese by Canadian procurement. I mean, BC, David Eby has completely canceled all American procurement. We've got digital service tax, delays in eliminating Class 7 milk, zero plastic waste agenda, restrictions on U.S. seed exports, Online Streaming Act, and Quebec's Bill 109. Says new streaming digital manufacturers promoting French language content. The U.S. says it will closely monitor implementation, any potential implications on USMCA. Moving ahead, Dominic LeBlanc has asked a hard question from a journalist here talking about, well, Canada-U.S. trade negotiations. Nothing has happened. Clearly, they're starting to pick up that they're not trying to get a deal.
Minister, your story seems to be everything's normal. Like, this is all normal. But Trump cuts us off. You're kind of engaged with Washington, but you're not public about it at all. And it feels like the Mexicans are way ahead. That's what Canadians see anyway. If I understand you correctly, none of that is true. Everything is moving along swimmingly. Don't worry. There's a lot at stake, though, right? People are worried. Am I wrong?
I mean, Graham, I would never purport to tell a senior national journalist that you're wrong. Far be it from me to correct a senior national journalist. To ask the question, you've categorized it in a very simplistic or a very blunt way. I don't share that simplistic conclusion. You chose a bunch of words that weren't mine.
Well,
I
it was
do
a characterization of the tone.
Sure, and you can.
I don't know what to say because we're not actually negotiating. We're just trying to stall to get a majority government because we don't love this country. We just want power.
View is that the conversations with U.S. counterparts remain productive and we remain engaged. That is different than October. We have said all along that there will be bilateral conversations.
Oh, thank goodness they're having conversations and they're engaged. You guys could get a deal in 2 weeks, in 1 week. Go there for a weekend, you can get a deal. Just put it all on the table, negotiate. What are the give, what are the take? They don't want a deal. They are sabotaging our country.
Between Mexico and the United States, between Canada and the United States, there are some different issues that Mexico and Canada will want to address with the Americans. I spend a lot of time with the Mexican economy minister. Secretary Ebrard was, of course, as you know, in Mexico with a number of colleagues. So I remain also in conversations, very easy, open conversations with him. And they are resolving in their national interest or advancing in their national interest, their conversations. We'll do exactly the same thing.
So many conversations, so little deals.
Who is ahead at what particular moment in time isn't as interesting as ensuring that Canada gets to the conclusion in a way that's important for Canadian workers, because a lot is at stake. There's something I completely agree with you on. And that's why I think Canadians should be confident that the government is very much engaged in this file.
He looks stressed. He looks nervous. He was stumbling over his words there. He kind of got saved by the reporter who jumped in. And when he mentioned how blunt and that's not how he characterized it, the reporter gave him a little bit of reprieve there to gather himself and come up with this mumbo jumbo. They're not doing anything. Conversations, this, that, and the other. Mexico's ahead. Canada's failing. This is all going to plan. They're sabotaging our country.
And also recognize, and this is why we were here today, a lot of questions on the Canada-US trade context, but we brought internal trade ministers with the government of Nunavut to Ottawa today to make significant progress on something that we can control. These internal trade barriers, major projects. You've heard the Prime Minister and my colleagues. So I think it's just important to note that we're not waiting by the phone to see if Jameson Greer or Howard Lutnick call or did I get somebody get a text message. We're very much on the job doing the work we can in Canada, while at the same time doing what is necessary to reassure Canadians on what is clearly a lot at stake.
They're not on the job. I mean, Mark Carney and Tim Hodgson both were on vacation for a week. Carney getting his bunions rubbed in Rome and Paris. They don't give a crap about our country or getting a deal. Does mainstream media sense the Liberal government's days may be numbered? A full election not far away. A lot of speculation if Carney will go for a big majority. They have to do it pretty soon, by the end of summer-ish, because at this rate with the conflict in Iran, Trump may lose some power. And then once that power gets pulled away, he's no longer so scary. That hurts the Liberals in the polls. So they'd have to do it sooner than later. Now we know that Mark Carney doesn't like campaigning, doesn't like working hard. So it's also possible he just runs with his shallow majority government. A true politician, 2 minutes and 25 seconds of not saying anything. Now jumping over to Rebel News, we got Ezra Levant doing an interview with Pete Hoekstra, the U.S. ambassador. Some interesting stuff coming out of this.
In his visit, his New World Order visit to Beijing, Prime Minister Mark Carney conceded something that had never been done, allowing 49,000 Chinese-made vehicles into the Canadian market every year.
I think it goes up to 70-some thousand, but whatever, yeah.
I'd like your thoughts on that from a trade point of view, from a negotiations point of view, and from a security point of view.
I think those cars can come in from China, come into Canada. They're not going to cross the border into the U.S. China's imports brought to you through Canada into the U.S., Chinese imports, that ain't going to happen, okay? The Canadians are going to buy it. If anybody buys those cars, it's going to be Canadians. You guys will have to take a look at it. I'm rather a simple guy on some of this stuff. It's kind of like, okay, if you're buying 49,000 cars that are made in China, that means that you're probably not going to be buying 49,000 cars that were built in Ontario. Okay, that's a Canadian decision. 49,000 cars is not enough cars to build a factory.
So he gets into all the numbers here, saying you need a lot more than that, 250,000 or so to build a factory. But what's interesting is this is an irritant to them, but they can control this by, not allowing those cars to come over the border. But it's clear they don't like Carney's new cozy relationship with Xi Jinping.
But those are decisions that Canada has to make. You had other factors in play, like exports of canola or canola that played into this and other tariffs. So that but we're not going to get involved in that. But we know that we're not going to open we're not going to open the floodgates to have Chinese cars coming into the U.S. from Canada. That ain't going to happen. And so security standpoint, with the technology that they now have built into cars, and I think some insurance companies or some states are looking at when you go out and buy your license plates, it's going to be dependent on how many miles you drive per year. And that number is not going to be, derived from a form that you fill out that says, I drove 11,500 miles last year. It'll come from some data that they're getting that has tracked your car for the last year. And they said, yeah, you said you drove 11,500. We're tracking it. You drove 13,321 miles. And here's exactly where you went. And so, I would expect coming out of the intelligence world that car driving around from China, it's a great gobbler of data and information. And it's consuming and getting information, and at times it will be sending information.
Secretly sending all that information back to China. CCP's got their agents everywhere, and including in cars and digital technology. They want as much information as possible. That's what they do. That's why they have the United Front Work Department. They send their people across the world to pull in as much information to have as much influence and power as possible in every single country they can, or countries that are interested in having influence and power in.
The United States Trade Representative has published its annual report of so-called foreign trade barriers, and it was revealing, listing a laundry list of trade beefs Washington has with Canada. They include, but are not limited to, supply management related to agricultural goods, no surprise there. Provincial sales bans on U.S. wine, beer, and spirits, notably imposed after Donald Trump launched his trade war with Canada. Buy Canadian procurement policies, much of which were also launched in response to the trade war. And the federal government's online streaming act that came into force in 2023, plus what the U.S. describes as Canada's failure to effectively enforce restrictions on the importation of products produced using forced labor. Canada's lead minister on the trade file, Dominic LeBlanc, was asked today about the updated list. He insisted he doesn't view the irritants laid out in the report as a barrier to the review of CUSMA.
Other countries have lists that are much longer than ours. We're working through constructively, as we have been for months, with the Americans, the bilateral issues they raise with Canada. That list is the annual list that they put out publicly. Nothing on that list was particularly surprising to Canada.
Yeah, that doesn't really bode well, does it? These guys aren't serious. They're not serious about getting a deal for us.
Our front bench is here to talk about that. Sharon Carr is a CTV News political analyst, and she's the former Deputy Chief of Staff to former Finance Minister Bill Morneau. Next to her, that's Sebastian Scavetti, is National Observer. And Jamie Ellerton is the principal at Canaptis and worked for Minister Jason Kinney during the Harper government. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. I'm sort of interested in this list, Sharon, because I find out way more information about what's going on in these negotiations and potential, irritants or cleavages between the two countries from the United States than I do from the Canadian government. What do you think of the way in which, on two instances this week, Minister LeBlanc has kind of been like, nothing to see here. We're still talking.
Well, I think their strategy from the get-go has always been not to negotiate in public. We see and we have seen how the U.S. tends to respond. So I don't think it's fair for anyone out there to say that negotiations aren't happening. I think there's irritants on both sides, and there's a lot of animosity in terms of where things stand. But there have been conversations. There are negotiations taking place.
Listen to her trying to smooth things over. Don't worry. They're talking. They're still talking. They're not talking.
Aren't happening publicly, which is not, I would say, unusual for someone like Prime Minister Carney, given his background in business. Sometimes you need to do things behind closed doors. But whether or not we're getting as far as we want to, I think there's still a pretty big delta between where we need to be. And a lot of it has to do with the U.S.'s perception of who we are as a country and what they think we owe them.
There's no deal coming.
The government afford, do you think, because there is, I think, a greater understanding among the Canadian public, Jamie, of sort of the unreasonableness, I guess, of the U.S. administration? Like, Canadians get it. You've said that many times on this program. Like, could the government be more transparent to any degree about what is actually happening without negotiating in public?
So I think they could be, Vashi, but I think the kind of reality of the situation of how much of this is unpredictable coming from the United States, the kind of political traps they'd be setting for themselves. Like, how many times have you heard Sebastian on this show talk about how Mark Carney blew his own deadline in July of last year? And so anything that they do put
And now we have the MOU with Alberta, and that deadline's long gone. Carney's not getting anything done.
Down in public, it's just going to be used to bat them over a head on programs like these and be kind of create this expectation or this perception in the eyes of Canadians that they're failing. And so I think because they have that goodwill with the Canadian people right now as a result of how this negotiation is going and the realities of it, I think the incentive for them to do so is kind of few and far between. And I also think probably for the betterment of the ultimate end result of these negotiations, that it's probably to Canada's benefit that this stays out of the headlines and not be front page news for days on end, because then you're going to get Donald Trump even more engaged and taking to True Social, and then the whole thing just becomes like the apple cart getting flipped, and the uncertainty that all that creates causes more headaches and could derail negotiations. So
we know what the strategy is here. The Liberals need to keep this going until they can get a majority government, and they're deciding whether they want to call an election or not.
Sebastian, your thoughts on sort of like the trajectory of the negotiations with the United States? I mean, I'm still not that clear. Tonda McCharles said to the minister a few days ago, it's clear as mud where things are. But at the same time, obviously, there are a lot of people who believe holding those cards close to the chest is not a bad strategic move.
Listen, I won't repeat, I think, what Jamie said, that I repeat like a broken record every week here about the Carney government setting out its own deadlines which they failed to meet. But I think one thing I want to point to is Minister LeBlanc in that press conference said that Liberals were elected to do two things. So one is to defend the Canadian worker, and two is to build projects in this country. And so I think instead of holding the Liberal government to kind of the measuring stick of these negotiations, which are often complex and not done necessarily on the timeline we want, I think we should hold them to what it is that they promised in the campaign. It's now, this time last year, we were in the middle of this election campaign where Prime Minister Carney, Minister LeBlanc, and every other Liberal in this country said that we would be building at unimaginable speeds, said that projects would be built in a way that we haven't ever seen before. And unfortunately for Canadians, we haven't seen any of that come to fruition. And I think that's kind of the bigger frustration that the Liberal government needs to worry, I think, than broken promises on deals with the United States necessarily, because those things are within their control. And Canadian workers are far worse off than they were a year ago. We've seen the unemployment numbers that have skyrocketed and the Prime Minister's very weak response to that. So I think that's where I'd draw the focus there and say that they need to really roll up their sleeves and get building, because time's ticking and Canadians are suffering with every passing minute.
The auto industry under the Liberals will disappear because Carney would rather sacrifice it to get his majority government, roll out his agenda. So they jump back to Sharon Kerr. Listen to this, talking about major projects, getting things built.
Sharon, I know the government would counter and say the job losses are worse in the United States, for example. There are other economic statistics around foreign direct investment that run counter to the narrative and the sort of message that Sebastian puts out there. Is it, though, the sort of, if I could be cheeky, the failure to launch on some of this stuff? Is it a potential political vulnerability for them?
Listen, I think one can politicize it and say it is, but anyone who understands how projects and things are built and done can tell you realistically you can't make a pipeline overnight. You can't do anything overnight. And for the longest time, our regulatory system here has been hyper, I would say, consultative. And I think we're getting to that point now, which is why we have the major projects offices, to get rid of the red tape. And we are seeing, we saw Alberta put their hand up as a proponent. We're seeing a lot of companies in the mining sector who are getting ready to go. It doesn't take, sometimes it's more than a year. There's been companies who have tried for 10, 20 years to build things. I think it's too soon to determine whether or not it's possible, because these things do take time.
She said it, 10, 20 years to get a permit. It doesn't have to take this long. She says the major projects office is going to save everything. That's why Carney set it up. In reality, that's just another layer of bureaucracy that will slow things down. There are thousands of major projects every single year in Canada. You think you can have every single one of those go through a single office? No, they just want to make sure that the most important projects that are related to Brookfield and Mark Carney's fund go through there, because then he can make the most amount of money.